Yeah, I've always found that people in oppressed countries seem to value the power of ideas more than people in free countries. They know that the regime fears competing ideas and that you can bring whole regimes down by the spread of good ideas. And that's really what transpired in Eastern Europe throughout the 1980s.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Undoctrination. I'm Maggie.
And I'm Olivia.
And this week we have on a very special guest. Larry Reed is the Foundation for Economic Education's President Emeritus, Humphrey Family Senior Fellow, and Ron Manners Global Ambassador for Liberty. Larry previously served as both the president and board chairman at FEE, and also served as the president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy for 21 years. He is also the most prolific writer I have ever personally met, and has written 8 books, one of which is called Are We Rome?, which is a huge trending topic right now. So we will get into that today. Larry, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Olivia.
Absolutely. So you have had an incredible career advocating for liberty across the globe, pretty much. I wanted to ask you what first sparked your interest in these ideas.
That goes back quite a ways to 1966, when I would have been 12 years of age. And my mother wanted to go up to Pittsburgh to see this new movie, The Sound of Music. And I remember not wanting to go because it sounded like, to me, a bunch of people singing and dancing on a stage or something. But she said, no, it's based on a true story. And I found the movie captivating, and it prompted me to want to learn more about Eastern Europe before World War II. And so I devoured everything I could read. And then in 1968, 2 years later, not in Austria, where the movie Sound of Music was set, but rather next door in Czechoslovakia, I began watching the events of Prague Spring unfold. When the communist government there began moving in a reform direction to free things up, they even started talking about having free elections. And the whole world watched that. And in the summer of '68, when the leader of the Soviet Union went to Czechoslovakia to have a meeting, he said, oh, we wouldn't invade. No, you can do what you want, basically. And then 3 weeks later, Warsaw Pact troops under the direction of Moscow invaded Czechoslovakia and put an end to that flowering of freedom. And I was incensed by that, and so I decided then I was going to try to do something, and I went to a demonstration in Pittsburgh, sponsored by Young America's Foundation, then called Young Americans for Freedom, and I participated in a demonstration protesting the Soviet invasion. And at that time, when you joined Young Americans for Freedom, as I did after that demonstration, you would get a box of material that you were expected to read. And it turned out most of it was from this place in Irvington, New York, called the Foundation for Economic Education. It included Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson and F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, several other books, and a subscription to the Foundation's magazine. And that's when I decided I'm not only going to devour this stuff, but I'm going to somehow figure out a way to make advancing liberty my occupation.
Wow, that's an incredible package to receive upon membership, I have to say. I wish they were still doing things like that. I have a similar story. I was in college and I joined Young Americans for Liberty. Right as soon as I got into college, I went up to the college Republicans and I was like, hey, where are the libertarians? I don't want to join you guys. I want to join the libertarians. And
the true believers.
Yes, exactly. And our YAL chapter had several books from FEE. And FEE at the time was still distributing all of these materials. And I read The Law by Frederick Bastiat. And before then, I had been kind of I didn't really know much about libertarianism, but I knew basics, and that was the first introduction to philosophy, and it changed my life forever.
Oh my
So
gosh, yeah.
very similar stories. And how old were you at the time?
1968, I would have been 14 that summer, turning 15 in the
gosh.
fall.
It's interesting how young you were when you got into it. I also think there's something to be said how media consumption kind of sparked your interest when you saw The
Yeah.
Sound of Music, which I love that movie too. I have great memories of seeing it with my grandparents. But do you have any observations in 2023 in modern times looking at how young people consume media and be sparked in either direction?
Yeah, I think, well, today, consumption of media is much more visual based, more video than in my day when it was printed material for the most part. And you only had 4 channels on TV. And of course, years away from an internet and YouTube and things like that. So I think we are, our attention spans today are shorter. People don't read 500-page books like they did when I was growing up. And even videos, I think, have gotten shorter because that's the nature of things today. If you don't grab them in the first minute or two, you may easily lose somebody because there's so many other things they can move on to.
Right. I just find it so interesting, I guess, how susceptible we are to propaganda. Do you think that Gen Z and millennials are more susceptible because their attention spans are shorter and there's just so much media out there?
I think there's truth to that. I really do think that. And maybe for another reason, too, that the teaching of critical thinking skills is not emphasized in most schools today like it was decades ago. And so if you're not much of a critical thinker, if you haven't learned things like logic and the importance of history and experience and that kind of thing, and if your attention span is short, you're going to be vulnerable to short, powerful snippets that come your way over the internet or by YouTube without really getting into a topic deeply enough, really analyzing it. So I worry about that. I think that is a factor today.
It is a hard balance to strike. I create short videos here now because I know it's like important for us to get involved in that space, but it's hard to really deep dive into a topic if you only have 30 seconds to do it, you know?
Yeah, that's right. We have to get better at that all the time to continue to appeal to young people.
So going back, I know that you had an experience where you traveled to the Soviet Union. You traveled there multiple times,
Yes.
right? What sparked your first trip?
My first trip to the Soviet Union was in March of 1985. And at that time, I had not been anywhere outside the U.S. except Canada. But I had a very good friend who was a professor in Connecticut. And every spring break, he would work with a tour company in Boston to take his best students on a tour somewhere. And they actually had a Soviet Union tour that took students to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Moscow, and some nearby places. And so my friend, this would have been in late '84, got a hold of me and he said, "Larry, we're going to the Soviet Union in March of '85. Why don't you come with us?" Well, that proved, and I did, and that was a very pivotal moment, it turned out, because the Soviet Union had gone from leader to leader, all in their 70s and 80s, and not being in the top job very long before they die. And I remember telling my dad a month or two before going on that trip, I said, "Dad, wouldn't it be great if while we're there, the premier, Chernenko was his name, what if he dies off while we're there? Maybe we'll get to see something special." Well, he did. And so we actually saw Margaret Thatcher in a vehicle driving through Red Square. We saw George Bush. They were there for the funeral of the Soviet leader, Chernenko.
Wow.
So it was a great month to be there, March of 1985.
And this was decades into the Soviet Union. What was your impression of, I don't know, the spirit of the people, the buildings? Like this is late stage Soviet Union.
Well, it certainly made me want to go back, and I did 4 more times while it was still the Soviet Union, before 1991. The tour company that my friend worked through had a deal where if you went on one of their tours, and then later wanted to go again and could find 15 paying customers, you got to go free as a chaperone. And so that's how I went to 4 more times.
Wow.
I didn't have to pay a nickel. And over that time, from 85 to 91, the last trip I made was in August of 91, 2 weeks before the actual coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. So that was another pivotal moment. And that was the 5th trip that I made when it was the old Soviet Union. But I remember seeing changes. The very first one was still old-style Soviet Union. The atmosphere was gray, the buildings were gray. You'd see communist propaganda everywhere across the top of buildings. I remember one very long building, Stalin-esque building, that had across the entire length of it in Russian what said, the Soviet people agree with the foreign policy of the Communist Party. And I'm
What?
when I asked our translator to tell me what that says, I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, what's the point of broadcasting it if they do? But that stuff began to disappear because Gorbachev came to power and he started easing up on some of the old communist rules and regulations and habits. And so I saw a progressively freer place in the late 80s. But it was also beginning to fall apart because historically, when the most perilous time for any dictatorship is when they begin to reform, because people get a taste for reform and they say, hey, that's pretty good. We want more of it. And so the Soviet Union was unraveling, in effect, under Gorbachev. And I observed that and was giving lectures around the country under the title, The Unraveling of the Evil Empire. And so when it actually happened, sooner than I thought it would, but when it actually happened, I was able to say, I kind of saw it from the inside.
You saw it coming, you predicted that.
Yeah, the economy falling apart, the long lines, you name it.
And you've mentioned before that you got in touch with kind of the underground libertarian movement. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, at first it was not necessarily libertarian, but it was underground. And it wasn't that I sought them out. In those days, people who were active in the Russian black market, they found you. If you wore blue jeans, they knew you were from overseas and they wanted to buy them. That was quite a common thing. I remember going to an ice cream store, morozhena, I think is the Russian word for ice cream. And, just before that, I'm sorry, it was a bookstore. And there was an English language section. And so I spent most of my time looking at that part. And a young man came up from behind and whispered something to me in English. He wanted to find out who it was and wanted to talk. Well, we went to a nearby ice cream store to carry on our conversation.
Ice cream
Yeah,
in Russia.
and here that's the way he met a lot of visiting Americans. He would go to that English language section of the bookstore and then invite them over to the ice cream.
That's genius.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And he now lives in the United States. I was able to sponsor him and his wife and young son to come to the United States in 1992, and they live now in Houston.
That's amazing. Yeah. And that first meeting, what happened there? What did he want?
Well, he was eager to trade and to buy things like blue jeans or to get something that we wanted that might not be readily available to a tourist. And but mainly we wanted to talk politics because we knew that with Chernenko having just passed away, there would soon be a new leader. The speculation around the world was it would either be this guy named Mikhail Gorbachev or another guy named Romanov. And I asked my young black market friend, his name was Konstantin, who he thought the new guy would be. And without skipping a beat, he said, Gorbachev, it won't be Romanov. And I said, why? And he said, because Romanov is from St. Petersburg and nobody from St. Petersburg ever gets the top job. Well, he was right. And Mikhail Gorbachev, within a week or so, became the new Soviet leader.
So being involved with these people in the black market and some political dissidents, did you get into anything that I guess would have gotten you in trouble if you ended up being caught?
Well, nothing major. In subsequent visits, there were a couple times when I took over a couple Bibles. I took over some free market literature. And even though they were customarily searching your luggage upon entry, nothing was ever found, and they didn't give me any trouble. And if it had been found, the worst that would have happened would have been, maybe they would have expelled me.
Okay.
But if you started doing things more serious than that, then you could run into more trouble. But
What if you weren't an American and if you were a citizen there? Would it be, I guess, heightened risk if you were caught doing some of those things?
yeah, it certainly would be. The authorities could cause trouble for you. They could make it more difficult for you to get ration coupons to get food. They could jeopardize your movement up the ladder at wherever you worked. They could cause trouble for you. And if they thought you were not just buying and selling, but were actually, say, advocating for liberal democracy, free market values, that could cause problems for you too. Now keep in mind that gradually became less of a problem during those few years of Mikhail Gorbachev. There was more freedom of speech in 1991 on the eve of the collapse of the country than there was in 1985. So I give Gorbachev some credit. He was trying to move things in the right direction in most ways.
When it did collapse, what was your sense? Were you shocked or you expected it to come?
I expected it to come, but I would never have put a date on it that soon.
Okay.
I was giving talks on the subject of the place coming apart from inside and the evidence for it that I could see. I thought increasingly with each passing visit that, gee, these reporters from the West who sit in Moscow or Petersburg and just repeat the official press releases are missing what's really going on around the country. They should get out and about amongst the people, take a few chances, and there you'll find there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the system, both the economic and the political system. I saw it coming, and when I gave a talk on that subject in more than one place, in fact, I've got news clippings to prove it, I said that at some point the Soviet Union is going to break up probably into the 15 constituent republics that make it up. And that's exactly what happened in 1991.
That's amazing. And after those trips, I know you kept kind of hopping around the world. Can you tell us about a few of those other freedom fighting trips?
Sure. I've always been interested since my teenage years in doing what I can to help people who are oppressed. And there's not much you can do if you're not from the country, but I would never hesitate to ask people when I went to communist countries, what can I do to help? And the trip that certainly left the biggest impact on me was my first one to communist Poland in 1986. The whole purpose of that trip as a freelance journalist was to discover the extent of the underground. What was it doing? Who was involved? And where did they need some assistance? So I spent every night at a different home, trying to stay a step ahead of the government. And I met people whose courage, to this day, has left a remarkable imprint on me. People who you could have said, as I did on more than one occasion, how are you going to win? You're up against the Army, Navy, and the Air Force of the evil empire, so to speak. How can you prevail? And I was just so impressed with the fact that they didn't know and didn't care so much when it might happen. They knew that freedom might not come to their country in their lifetime. Certainly if I had said in 1985 in Poland that you will be liberated in 4 years, people would have said, wow, and they wouldn't have believed it. But it's what happened. So if you get the right constellation of events and personalities and ideas, big changes can happen. And in Eastern Europe, even before the Soviet Union fell itself, that was happening in all over from Poland to Hungary to Romania. And that's why Eastern Europe broke off before the Russians themselves were liberated from communism.
Wow. Yeah, we were talking a little bit before this about Argentina, and I've had so many people ask, like, what can you do to help Argentina? And usually their answers are just spread the word.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
really all they want is like international attention.
Yeah, I've always found that people in oppressed countries seem to value the power of ideas more than people in free countries. They know that the regime fears competing ideas, and that you can bring whole regimes down by the spread of good ideas. And that's really what transpired in Eastern Europe throughout the 1980s.
And you and I have talked about this a lot, especially since you came back from your trip to Argentina, but the libertarian movement among the youth there is much larger than it is here. It's like way more socially acceptable to be a libertarian, and more people know about it, right?
Yeah, and I think that has to do with the level of freedom that's been stripped away. People don't value their freedom if they haven't had to fight for it, if it's not something they're longing for. It's
And they've tried
absence.
everything else.
Yeah, they really have. They really have. And Argentina is interesting because it's not a communist country. It's a country that's been infected by populism, really. Like, that's the big thing. So, they're, the big political dynasties there have been both right-wing and left-wing, but the main thing that connects them is that they use the government to play favors to different interest groups. But that has progressed to a point where people are genuinely suffering.
Yeah.
So it essentially has to get worse before it gets better here, I think, until people
maybe.
really start to realize that their freedoms have been stripped away. Because you and I and other young people involved in FIA and involved in the liberty movement recognize this because we know history, but to a large majority of, I think, Generation Z, and I think to your point, lack critical thinking and lack the ability and knowledge to look back into history and realize where things went wrong or to not repeat historical mistakes.
So speaking of history, Larry, I have a question for you. How often do you think of the Roman Empire?
I think of it every day, and I would have said that even before the recent very popular TikTok video about the Roman Empire. Yeah, I think it has many lessons to teach us, so I have been interested in it and its history for a long time.
Yeah, and I have read what you've written about the Roman Empire. I've watched speeches that you've given about the Roman Empire. And I think the big point that you make is that the Roman Empire fell because people lost their character. Do you feel like that is something that's happening currently in the United States?
Oh, yeah. I think personal character does not carry the importance to people that it once did just a few generations ago in the country. There's been a decline in some of the great virtues that really make for a free and strong society, including honesty. Polls have shown that. In fact, a recent poll showed that for the first time, more Americans than not believe that truth is relative, that there are no moral absolutes.
It's about my truth and your truth and our collective truth.
That does not surprise me, by the way, because that is something that most young people would say is like,
just living my truth.
It's relative,
As if my truth or his truth or her truth is distinct from the truth and just as valid. It isn't. When it comes to truth, there's the truth, period. And you're either in line with it or you're not. But just having an opinion doesn't necessarily make it the truth.
Yeah.
So you've seen a decline in that. You've seen a decline in respect for other people's property. You've seen, and not only in terms of crime in the streets, but in voting yourself benefits at other people's expense. So yeah, I see a lot of parallels between ancient Rome and its decline and what we're witnessing here.
So what happened in the last days of the Roman Empire? Where was the turning point?
Well, ancient Rome really has two distinct periods, about 500 years each. First 500 is the period of the Roman Republic with a substantial degree of freedom. The second half is the period of the empire, where you had a dictatorship. I think the parallels to present events are more striking if you look at that period of the Republic, because like America, the Roman Republic was founded in a revolt against tyranny, and they established a republic that limited the size and scope and intrusiveness of government. So they lost all of that before they went on to a 500-year dictatorship as an empire. The decline of the republic began in about the last century of it, the last 100 out of the 500 years of the republic. And that's where you see everything from costly foreign adventures to the rise of the dole at home, of people voting for benefits from the government.
Sounds familiar.
Yep, and politicians, demagogues competing with
Yeah.
each other for people's votes based on what they could promise them. That really gathered steam in the last century of the Republic. And that produced civil strife and conflict, and finally people were ready to sacrifice their liberties when the strong man came along and said, I will bring order out of chaos. And there went their liberties.
Wow.
So as somebody with extensive knowledge on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and you saw pretty much firsthand the fall of the Soviet Union and the changeover, and you visited a lot of other countries around the world, do you think we have more time, or do you think it's coming soon, or what do we do?
What are we thinking?
Yeah, that's a question.
Got some plans to make.
I get that question a lot, and of course nobody knows the future. But I remain an optimist. I don't think that decline is inevitable. I do think that it's going to be very difficult to reverse it without some very difficult moments. You can't inflate the currency and run the tab up as we have with our national debt and unwind that easily. It will be painful. We just have to hope that we do that before the whole thing collapses in hyperinflation or economic chaos. So for the long term, I'm still optimistic that at some point, maybe prompted by events we can't predict, by personalities who might appear on the scene that we don't know, I think for the long term, the odds are we will still recover from all this, restore the things that made us great in the first place, and see a better day for liberty. I have to hope for that. I have to think that will come, because pessimism is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It really is. I do think things have felt significantly worse, maybe in the past 3 years. Is that something you felt?
Yeah. Without getting political in any way, you can't help but watch what's been happening in Washington and shake your head and say they seem to be completely oblivious to deficit spending now that is well in excess of $1 trillion a year.
And is robbing us of our future.
It seems like it's the only thing that Democrats and Republicans can agree upon, because they do all
It's to
this
spend more
bickering
money.
on Twitter and they do all this bickering, but behind closed
All the
doors they shake
showboating.
hands on voting for this bill and voting for this tax raise and voting for this deficit increase for whoever's budget, and it's all quid pro quo and all of that. And it makes me a little bit sad, because frequently, especially on this podcast, we kind of criticize those on the left who are doom and gloom. They're anti-natalists. They say, well, there's no point bringing kids into this world because climate change and war and poverty, and it's going to be so horrible, and we should just basically give up.
Yeah.
And it's almost hard to reconcile my dislike of those opinions when we're faced with this level of deficit, with this level of spending and taxation and inflation. What do you say to keep the young people who are liberty-minded optimistic for the future?
Well, I tell them, look, as I mentioned a moment ago, pessimism is a self-fulfilling prophecy, that if you give up, if you think all is lost, that there can be no turnaround, then you'll stop working as hard as you might otherwise for what you know to be right, and you'll stop being effective at convincing others to join your cause. Nobody wants to sign up for something you tell them is a losing proposition. So there's no point to pessimism other than to achieve the very thing that you oppose or fear. So you have to look back at those times in human history when a reliance upon freedom created unbelievable improvements and change. You know, people are amazingly resilient and adaptable when you give them the freedom to go as far as their spirits will take them. I have no problem with tackling climate change as long as people are free to do so. If you try to mandate, barking orders at people in order to somehow solve a problem, you almost always only make it worse. But if free people can solve just about anything that you can throw at them.
Okay, that makes me feel better.
Good.
I feel better too. Larry, this has been amazing. I think this is a good place for us to wrap. Is there anything that you would like to promote anywhere our audience can find you and read more of your content?
Well, of course, I'm on fee.org quite a lot.
Yes.
I also publish sometimes elsewhere. If you want to go to just my stuff, go to my website, which is lawrencewreed.com. And there you'll find 90% of the articles will take you to fee.
Yeah.
But at least my stuff's all in one place. So I would encourage people to visit my website.
Yeah, and you guys, his articles are great. I read them very frequently. I learned so much history from you. So thank you so much for coming on. It really was an honor.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Olivia, where can we find you?
As always, guys, I'm on Twitter at Rondeau Olivia and Instagram at Rondeau.Olivia.
Great. And you can find me on Twitter at Liberty Anders. Make sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. Leave us a comment, a question for Larry. We'd love to have you back on in the future. And I hope you guys have an amazing week.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.